Am I on? I think so. Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome you to another section of Abralinha ao Vivo Linguists Online, today featuring Professor Michael Ullman. My name is Ingrid Finger, and I'm a professor and researcher on psycholinguistics and bilingualism at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Porto Alegre. As you know, Abralinha ao Vivo Linguists Online is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association in a joint project with the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Latin American Association of Linguistics and Philology, the Argentinian Association for Linguistic Studies, the International Association for Applied Linguistics, the European Linguistics Association, and the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Australian Linguistic Society, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. This event is designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussions on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language during this difficult quarantine period. Thank you, Miguel, and all the Abralinha team for organizing this wonderful series of lectures. Today, we have a very, very special guest, Professor Michael Ullman. I'm deeply honored to introduce him tonight. Michael is a brilliant scientist, a very well-renowned researcher, but for me, he's also a very dear friend. I had the privilege of spending a year at his lab during my postdoc almost a decade ago. He's the person from whom I have learned all I know about the role of memory in language learning. His DP model is a very powerful theoretical framework and has had an enormous impact in my understanding of the neural basis of bilingualism and second language learning, and has deeply influenced my career. That's why I say it's an enormous privilege to be hosting him today in this live. Dr. Ullman received his PhD from the Department of Brain and Cognitive Science at MIT in 1993 under the advice of Professor Steven Pinker. He's professor in the Department of Neuroscience at Georgetown University with secondary appointments in the departments of neurology and psychology. He's director of the Brain and Language Laboratory and the Georgetown EEG-ERP Lab. He teaches undergraduate, master's, PhD, and medical students. Professor Ullman is a member of the editorial and advisory boards in many important linguistics and cognitive science journals, such as the Brain and Language, Linguistic Approaches to Bilingualism, Cognitive Science, Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, among others, and has acted as a reviewer for several books, chapters, and proposals for many publishers. Michael has collaborators literally all over the world. He's a very prolific researcher and has had over 15,000 citations in the past 5 years alone, according to Google Scholar. And all his publications are available for download at the Brain and Language Lab's website. Dr. Ullman's research examines the neurocognition of first and second language, map, reading, and memory, how these domains are affected in various disorders like autism, dyslexia, developmental language disorder, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and Huntington's disease, and how they may be modulated by factors such as genetic variability, sex, handedness, and aging. Professor Ullman's research focuses especially on understanding how language learning and use depend on evolutionary ancient learning and memory systems in the brain, declarative memory and procedural memory. His declarative procedural model of language has greatly affected the field of second language acquisition, psycholinguistics, and cognitive neuroscience. Professor Ullman's talk today is entitled Language Learning Relies on Brain Circuits That Predate Humans, Evidence from Typical and Atypical Language Development. Michael, we thank you immensely for joining us today. We're very pleased to have you here. Before we begin, let me remind everyone to post their questions on the chat during the talk. And now I turn this over to you, Michael.
Thank you very, very much, Ingrid. That was really, really nice. And thank you, Miguel and other organizers for inviting me. I really appreciate that. So let me see if I can get this technology to work. Okay, is that working? Okay. Let me know if it's not working. Okay, so As Ingrid said, this is the title of my talk. Language learning relies on brain circuits that predate humans, evidence from typical and atypical language development. The main point of the talk, the take-home message, is that in the last 20 plus years, increasing evidence has suggested that language learning, representation, and processing depend importantly on two learning and memory systems in the brain, declarative and procedural memory, as they're often called. And these systems predate language in humans and predate humans as well. So they're very old. They seem to underlie both first and second language, as we'll see, although somewhat in different ways. One of the main interesting things about this dependence on language on the two memory systems is that we know a lot about the memory systems from both animal and human studies, how learning occurs in them, their neural structures, their neural bases, their genetics, all kinds of things, including, for example, how learning and retention can be improved in them. Therefore, from this independent knowledge of the two memory systems, we can make very powerful predictions and often novel predictions about language. So it's a very powerful approach in principle. Okay? So that's the take-home message. Now let's start the actual talk first. I'd like to thank my collaborators and funders in this broad research project, both at Georgetown and elsewhere, including Ingrid, of course. Just want to say that I would encourage collaboration in general for the more junior scientists listening to this, because collaboration is fun, you learn a lot, and it's very productive as well. And you make good friends. Okay, so let's first look at the motivation and approach of this research program. After this slide, we will look at the background of the memory systems, declarative and procedural memory, and how they interact, then look at predictions that derive from them for language, and then we'll look at evidence, first at first language, then at second language, and then at developmental disorders with a focus on developmental language disorder or specific language impairment. So, evolution and biology tend to reuse existing systems or mechanisms for new functions, for new purposes. This is just how it works in general. So, for example, scales evolved into feathers. Feathers themselves were first apparently used for thermal regulation, only later were adapted for flight. Fins evolved into limbs and wings and hands. Coming full circle, the wing may be used in some birds to swim, or in my favorite examples, to shade prey. So there are certain species of heron, these are water birds, that spread their wings like this. You can really see me, okay? Is thought to better see the frogs and their fish that they want to eat, right? So there's an existing structure of the wings with no structural adaptations whatsoever, used for an entirely new purpose. So this principle of reuse, which is called co-optation, okay, as a result of this principle, we should expect that language should depend, at least in part, if not largely, on pre-existing brain systems. Whether or not those brain systems have become further specialized for language, either evolutionarily, okay, phylogenetically, and or through learning or development ontogenetically. And we simply focus on two systems in this research program, declarative memory and procedural memory, since most, if not all, of language has to be learned, and these are arguably the two most important learning and memory systems in the brain. During the talk, declarative memory will be on this side, procedural memory on this side. Just to make it easier for you, and declarative memory will be in this green color, and procedural memory in this reddish color. So our approach is simply, in this research program, is simply to test if and how various aspects of language depend on these systems. That's it. Okay, what's the relation between these memory systems and language? One of the main advantages of this approach, as I mentioned in the introductory slide, is that from both animal and human studies, we know a lot about these systems. Computational basis, the anatomical basis, molecular, endocrine, genetic, all kinds of things, including how learning and retention can be improved in these systems, which we'll get to later a couple of times. Thus, based on this independent knowledge of the learning and memory systems, we can make specific, novel, testable predictions that might be unwarranted to make in the more circumscribed study of language, meaning that there may be no reason to make in the more limited of study of language alone. So, for example, we know very little about the genetics of language, right? But we know a fair bit about the genetics of these two memory systems. So we can simply make predictions about language, the genetics of language, based on this independent knowledge of the genetics of the two memory systems. So this is a very powerful approach, as I mentioned before. It doesn't mean it's right. You always have to keep in mind that, arguably, depending how you think about it, most science is wrong. Most theories are at least partially, if not largely, wrong. And a lot of science, empirical work isn't replicable. Nonetheless, I think, as we'll see in this talk, there's something that's more or less right about this approach. So here's the bottom line that we'll see during the talk, and then I'll have the same slide with a bit more detail towards the end. Okay, and this is because repetition is good, right, for learning. So as we'll see, converging evidence from different types of methods and approaches suggests that language, in fact, depends on both learning and memory systems, and that lexical and grammatical knowledge depend differentially on the two systems. Specifically, the learning and use of idiosyncratic, that is lexical knowledge, we'll see depends heavily on declarative memory, but not very much, if at all, probably a little bit, on procedural memory. In contrast, rule-governed, that is grammatical knowledge, depends heavily on procedural memory, but also to a fair extent on declarative memory as a function of various factors, including subject-level factors, item-level factors, input factors, and others as well. For example, grammar seems to depend on declarative memory more in females than males, more in second language, L2, than in first language, L1, more in individuals with DLD, developmental language disorder, also known as specific language impairment, than typically developing children, more in people with Parkinson's disease, particularly, I may mention this later, in women with Parkinson's disease who have better compensatory abilities. So these things interact in interesting ways. Than in controls, or for example, for higher frequency items. If you hear the cat or walked many, many times, you'll start remembering it as a big word, as a chunk, as it's called. Whereas if you don't hear it lots of times, then you won't remember it as a chunk, and you might compose it with rules, put it together in procedural. Thus, the two memory systems play at least partially redundant roles in that, at least for grammar, both can support grammar, although in somewhat different ways and to different extents. Okay, so in this respect, grammar is redundantly subserved by both systems. So now let's look at the memory systems. First, declarative memory in this slide, then procedural memory, and then some ways in which the two systems interact that are key for what I'll talk about today, then predictions for language, and we'll look at evidence. So declarative memory. What's this beast? So declarative memory is found in other vertebrates. It helps birds remember where they put their acorns, for example. This system may be specialized for learning what, as it's often thought about. For example, remembering an event, episodic memory. So for example, 2 evenings ago, I made lamb shanks with walnuts and tomato and so on. It was very, very good. So that's an event, a personally experienced event. That's an episodic event. Or knowing a fact, semantic knowledge. Right? And I like geography, so I usually use a geographic example. So the fact that Brasilia is the capital of Brazil, but before that, it was Rio for 2 centuries, and before that, Salvador. Okay, so this is just semantic knowledge. The system seems to be specialized for learning arbitrary bits of information and associating them, such as, dinner, Michael, 2 days ago, lamb shanks, or capital, Brazil, Brasilia, Rio, Salvador. Okay. Learning is very rapid in this system. Even a single presentation of information is sufficient for learning. You know now this information about both Brazil if you didn't before, as well as what I had for dinner. And knowledge is not only, this is important because it's a misconception by many people, knowledge is not just explicit in this system. That is, this system not only supports explicit knowledge, knowledge that can be brought to conscious awareness, but also implicit, knowledge that cannot be brought to conscious awareness. That is, these memory circuits underlie both types of knowledge. How about the functional neuroanatomy, speaking of the memory circuits? Right? What parts of the brain do what? This system is rooted in the hippocampus, okay, and other medial temporal lobe structures, which together underlie the learning of new information and their consolidation, which can be thought of in terms of stabilization of those memories after learning. Okay? In contrast, over the longer term, that knowledge seems to depend more on neocortex, especially in the temporal lobes, but not only in the temporal lobes, which, as I said, underlie long-term storage. So what are these structures for those of you who have less of a brain background? So here we see a slice kind of this way, so kind of like this, okay? So the front of there's the nose down here, the back of the head. And if you slice it that way, then you might see, it's not, of course, colored in the real brain, where this blue colored thing is, that structure is the hippocampus. And then nearby structures here also are other medial temporal lobe structures, like entorhinal perirhinal cortex and posterior parahippocampal cortex. And if you slice this way, you see them as well here. Hippocampus, entorhinal cortex, perirhinal cortex, and some nearby structures. Okay, so that's the medial temporal lobe, and then neocortex is basically everything on the outside of the main part of the brain called the cerebrum. Okay, that's what I'm referring to by neocortex. And so the temporal lobes are, this is the temporal lobe, it's under your temples, that's why it's called the temporal lobe, after the bone, in fact. And so these areas underlie more learning, and this is sort of long-term storage. And then other regions play roles as well in this system. For example, certain frontal regions like Brodmann's area 47 and 45 here, okay, underlie like the pulling out of this information, the recall of this information. So this is a network, a circuit, subserving learning of memory of this particular type that is rooted in medial temporal lobes, in particular the hippocampus. We also know something about the lower level biological substrates. For example, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine plays a very important role in this memory system. Neurotransmitters are simply the molecules that allow neurons to communicate with each other. The hormone estrogen is a little picture of the molecule estrogen. One of the estrogens plays a role in declarative memory with higher estrogen associated with better declarative memory. This probably helps explain why females tend to have better declarative memory than males. It's not absolute. Various genes are known to play a role. Back to that earlier slide that I talked about this, including, for example, the proteins BDNF and ApoE, as well as others. Remember that all the genes do is they make proteins. That's what a gene does, right? And so this protein is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And in fact, there's a single point mutation in the nucleotides in the bases of the gene underlying BDNF, which there's variability in genes across people, right? And so some people have one nucleotide there, other people another, and so this is called a single nucleotide polymorphism. And those people with one version have the resulting one amino acid resulting protein, and the other people have another version, methionine versus valine. And just from that difference, people have larger or smaller hippocampi and better or worse declarative memory. Pretty cool. ApoE actually makes sense. This is apolipoprotein E. Very heavily, it's the strongest genetic risk factor by far for Alzheimer's disease, which is involved in major symptoms there is problems with declarative memory. So that makes sense as well. So we know a lot about these systems. And so we can make predictions based on this, based on language, as I mentioned before. How about procedural memory? We know less about procedural memory than declarative memory, but we still know a fair bit. So this is also found in other vertebrates. For example, it helps rats follow rule-governed grooming sequences, like the order in which they clean themselves. This is often characterized as underlying knowledge for how you do something. That is the learning and processing of motor and cognitive skills. For example, learning to type or to ride a bicycle, learning sequences, categories, rules, or in one of the best studied paradigms in rodents, route learning, navigation. So if you put rodents, for example, in it's called a T maze, so the bottom of the T here, and then reward them when they turn always in one direction, left or right, then they learn to navigate in that way based on this system, based on basal ganglia-based procedural memory. The system may be specialized, the way it works, for learning to predict, for example, the next itemized sequence, the output of a rule, or, for example, to turn left if you're going to be rewarded for turning left. Especially, a fair bit of evidence to suggest that it's based on rapid feedback. If the result of the prediction, if you're getting information, the reward or basically acknowledgement of whether your prediction was correct or incorrect rapidly, such as the reward for turning left for a rat, then that results in learning in procedural memory. If it's slow or no feedback, then it appears not to be result in learning in procedural memory, at least not easily. Learning in the system is gradual. You don't learn to ride a bicycle it takes you a while to learn it. You don't learn to ride a bicycle right away. Eventually, however, the skills are rapid and reliable, right? You can, they're what's called automatized. Riding a bicycle is really, really easy, rapid, very, very reliable, not effortful. And there's excellent retention. You don't really forget how to ride a bicycle. And the knowledge in this system apparently is only implicit. So this is actually kind of important. You are not defining procedural memory in terms of implicit knowledge, just happens to be one of its characteristics. We're defining the two memory systems in terms of the learning and memory that rely respectively on either the hippocampus and associated circuits or the basal ganglia and associated circuits. So given that, let's turn to the functional neuroanatomy. This system is rooted in frontal basal ganglia circuits. Let me show you what those are. So frontal lobe, of course, is part of the cerebrum. That's here, frontal lobe, okay, here. Remember, the temporal lobe was here. And there are also structures deep inside the brain. One of them is this set of structures called the basal ganglia, which you can see here in purple, okay? It's actually a bunch of structures. That's why it's basal ganglia, okay, including the caudate nucleus, the putamen, both of which I'll talk about, as well as some other structures like the globus pallidus and others as well. So the basal ganglia and the frontal cortex play somewhat different roles in procedural memory, just like the hippocampus and medial temporal lobe structures and neocortex play somewhat different roles in declarative memory. The basal ganglia, in particular, anterior portions of the caudate nucleus and putamen are more important for learning new stuff, particularly during early phases of learning and subsequent consolidation. In contrast, the neocortical regions, frontal regions, motor and premotor cortex, and nearby, as well as parietal cortex to some extent, are more important for processing of automatized routines. So here we see premotor cortex and nearby Brodmann's area 44, actually in traditional Broca's area, which you may have heard of. All of these are basically premotor or premotor-related regions that play an important role in procedural memory, as well as primary motor cortex here. Okay, so we know about the circuitry. How about the lower level biological substrates? The neurotransmitter dopamine plays a key role. In fact, that's what underlies reward-based learning in the system, based on rapid feedback. And possible genes, we know less about the genes, just like we know less in general about this system than in declarative memory, but possible genes include those for the proteins FOXP2, DARP32. FOXP2, you may recognize as the infamous language gene. Actually, it's very important for procedural memory, which may at least partly, if not largely, explain its roles in language, and dopamine-related genes like DARP32. The two memory systems also interact. So I'll talk about two types of interaction here. Cooperative interaction, which we which we think about in terms of redundant mechanisms, to use the same term that I used before. Some tasks and functions, some things we learn are learnable only by one or the other system, that is by either declarative or procedural memory. In particular, most importantly, declarative memory seems to be necessary, critical for learning arbitrary bits of information in their relations. These can't be learned very easily otherwise, other than declarative memory. In contrast, procedural memory might be critical for some things, possibly there's some evidence for motor skills particularly, or some motor skills, particularly those that become automatized. Other tasks and functions, and I think it's going to be the case that it's the vast majority of those for higher level cognition, including language, can be learned by both systems, okay? But generally in different ways. So for example, we saw that route learning navigation can be learned in procedural memory, by automatically turning left. This is referred to as response learning in rats, right? But how else can we navigate? We as well as rats, by the way, right? With landmarks. So if there's a picture of Ingrid on the wall, right? Of course, the rat will turn towards Ingrid, right? That you can actually test if they're using that landmark as opposed to this response-based learning, response learning based on procedural memory by rotating the T-maze, and now they would, if they were turning towards the landmark, towards the picture of Ingrid, they would turn the opposite direction, okay? And this is called place learning. It depends on the hippocampus. So you can navigate both with response learning based on procedural memory and with place learning based on declarative memory. So using different strategies, you can solve the problem of navigation. That gives, I think, gives the essence of what we're getting at here. There's a lot of work in humans on the same kind of thing with sequence learning and categories, learning rules, different types of learning that depend more on declarative or procedural memory for each. And finally, various factors, various variables that affect which of the two systems, declarative or procedural memory, is relied on more. So for example, which system is faster at learning, right? Well, it's declarative memory, we've seen that, right? So what often happens for things like these, okay, like navigation, or we'll see grammar, that can depend on either system is that it's learned initially in declarative memory and then gradually comes to rely on procedural memory, which learns more slowly. Another factor is what we call functionality. So if some people are better, or one group or individual, for example, is better at declarative memory, they will tend to rely more on declarative memory for those things like navigation that can rely on either system versus people who are better at procedural memory, okay? And there are other factors as well. And actually, this leads us directly into this competitive type of interaction, what we call the seesaw effect. So increasing evidence suggests that the predominance of one system, which system is stronger, okay, that when one system is stronger, it can block or inhibit the other system. So this partially explains why, for example, we depend first on declarative memory initially and then procedural memory, because initially declarative memory learns, okay, and procedural memory hasn't learned very well, but gradually procedural memory gets stronger and then it predominates and even blocks declarative memory. So not only is it stronger, but actually further inhibits. It actually inhibits procedural memory. And actually, if you then lesion, for example, procedural memory, you actually get back declarative memory, which is pretty cool. This is shown most clearly in rodents. And in fact, along the same lines, dysfunction of one system may enhance the functionality of the other. A lesion may enhance the other, possibly because it's releasing inhibition. And estrogen seems to not only enhance declarative memory, as I mentioned before, but also inhibit procedural memory, probably through the same mechanism. Once it's enhanced, then it inhibits the other. So we know a lot about this, which is pretty cool. And this could be applied to language. And probably already some of you are thinking, blocking. Yes, in fact, that seems to be related. Okay. So with this independent knowledge, information about the two memory systems, what predictions can we make for language? Right? That's kind of the essence of this DP, declarative procedural model of language. So one of the key things we've seen about declarative memory is that declarative memory seems to be necessary and seems to be critical for learning arbitrary bits of information, their associations. Therefore, we should expect that lexical memory should depend critically on declarative memory. That is, lexical memory is the memory store of at least, not only, all word-specific information, such as simple words like cat and what it means, irregular idiosyncratic information like taking Doug as its past tense, and in syntax too, idiosyncratic information, such as the fact that devour in English requires a direct object. It's the fact of English. How about procedural memory? Well, procedural memory seems to be some of its characteristics are that it underlies sequences and rules, and prediction is key. Well, this is reminiscent of grammar, right? All of this seems to be important for grammar too. So we might expect that procedural memory is important for grammar. That is the rule-governed hierarchical and sequential composition and decomposition of complex forms, again, across different aspects of language. In syntax, for example, combining words like the and cat, or combining categories like noun phrase and verb phrase, or integrating features into the hierarchy, or in morphology, for example, in regular morphology, combining the stem with the affix, in English, the example here, or in phonology, combining different segments, different phonemes, different syllables according to novel forms you haven't heard before, according to the phonological grammar of the language, that is the phonotactics. But we can memorize lyrics and speeches. Certainly we can memorize the cat, and maybe we can even memorize as a kind of a structure, noun phrase, verb phrase, along the lines of construction grammar, right? So we might expect that at least in terms of this kind of memorization of what might be called chunks, that what procedural memory is normally underlying in terms of grammar, that is combining things, could also be subserved by declarative memory, but rather than combining, as memorizing chunks, right? In fact, that's what words are. That's what cat is. After you figure it out that you can combine the different segments in Blick, right? Eventually you just store that. So it turns out actually, and we'll talk about some of this today, that declarative memory can do a fair bit of work, clearly less than procedural memory in subserving grammar, but a fair bit of work in doing subserving grammatical functions, including not only by memorizing chunks, including possibly abstract chunks like noun phrase, verb phrase, but also in learning rules, explicitly and possibly implicitly, and in other ways as well, such as associative generalization in an analogy-based way, which I'm not going to talk about today. Okay. So finally, we can ask, what are the factors that modulate the extent to which grammar depends on one or the other system? And there are a whole bunch of different factors. This is one major aspect of our research program. I'll talk about some of these today, not others. So at the subject level, for example, we have the factor sex, that is male versus female, right? So if you have males at some arbitrary baseline for declarative and procedural, then so this is males, then females should be better at declarative memory, possibly worse at procedural memory, for which there's some evidence, not much, due to the seesaw effect. And therefore, compared to males, females should rely more on declarative memory for grammar. And in fact, the evidence seems to support this, a number of studies. It's part of our research program. How about second versus first language, which I will talk about more today. So one of the key differences between second and first language is the second language is learned later, right? That's why it's second. Right? So we can look at how well each system learns at different ages, what might be called the learning trajectory in each system. So how about declarative memory? So when you're very young, how good is declarative memory at learning? Pretty bad, right? You don't remember much from when you were 1 or 2 years old. It's even a term for it. It's called infantile amnesia. So you're pretty bad, you get better and better and better, and then you seem to plateau. People are the best at learning in declarative memory around adolescence, early adulthood, then it goes down like so much else. In contrast, although we know less about procedural memory, more and more evidence suggests that learning in procedural memory is pretty good from the get-go, from early years. And then it seems to decline, actually, during childhood, adolescence. So that means that a young child, will have pretty bad declarative memory, pretty good procedural memory. So what should they depend on for grammar? Procedural memory. Whereas a young adult, for example, a 20-year-old, have pretty good declarative memory, somewhat attenuated procedural memory, so they should depend more on declarative memory than a first language learner at the same stage. However, of course, procedural memory is not defunct. It's just somewhat worse, somewhat attenuated. A 20-year-old can still learn to ride a bicycle, for example. So with enough experience, perhaps of the right sort, okay, particularly of the right sort, then procedural memory should gradually learn the grammar, although maybe never to the same extent as a first language learner. Okay, so that's the bottom line for first versus second language. And then finally, the main other point that we're going to talk about today is procedural system dysfunction. So here we have declarative memory, procedural memory. So if procedural memory is bad, well, declarative memory may be a little bit better, first of all, for the seesaw effect. But basically, this should compensate for these problems. So you should have procedural memory problems and grammar problems, but there should be to some extent compensation from this from declarative memory. We've already talked about this frequency of complex forms. This was the point that I mentioned before, that if you hear the cat or walked many, many times, you'll start memorizing it as a chunk in declarative memory. Talked about how much L2 input. So more L2 input means increases the likelihood of proceduralization. This is a really neat one. It's only there's only starting to be work on this. Actually hasn't been much at all in the language world. Basically, since fast feedback seems to push learning towards procedural memory, whereas slow feedback or none at all pushes learning towards declarative memory, this can modulate the amount, the relative dependence of learning grammar on the two systems. There's also evidence, empirical evidence, that immersion pushes learning towards procedural memory and instruction towards declarative memory. That makes some sense, right? Because instruction means explicit instruction, right? Since declarative but not procedural memory underlies explicit knowledge, that makes sense. In addition, it might be, and this is speculation, kind of neat though, that immersion might work because of rapid feedback. So basically, in an immersion situation, if you're listening to a native speaker, for example, then you are presumably making predictions about the incoming stimuli, and if those predictions, the fact that the stimuli are coming rapidly means that your predictions will be confirmed or disconfirmed very rapidly, and hence it's sort of a good setup for learning in procedural memory. Okay, so now let's turn to evidence. So we seek to test our predictions in our theory and specific hypothesis with converging evidence, since every approach, every method, every task has its weaknesses as well as its strengths. So converging evidence is really key in different approaches. Today, I'm going to talk about those in yellow, so correlational evidence, which I'll explain in the next slide, I believe. Neurological evidence focusing on developmental language disorder, DLD, that is specific language impairment. Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease a little bit, aphasia and amnesia, neuroimaging evidence from fMRI and PET, and electrophysiological evidence from event-related potentials. So the rest of the talk is evidence. First, we'll look at first language, L1, with simply 4 slides: behavioral evidence, neurological evidence, neuroimaging evidence, and electrophysiological evidence. Then we'll turn to second language after a couple of slides to remind you of the hypotheses and predictions. We'll present 4 slides for behavioral, neurological, neuroimaging, and electrophysiological evidence. Then there's a kind of a fun extra slide I added showing how second language learning and retention can be enhanced, improved based on principles that are known to enhance learning and retention in declarative memory. And then we'll turn to neurodevelopmental disorders, or DLD, with a focus on DLD, developmental language disorder, focusing on behavioral, neuroimaging, and electrophysiological evidence. And then I'll talk about some implications very briefly in the slide, and then some new directions, examining the role of memory systems in reading and math and in language declines and aging, just in one slide. Okay, so these are the 4 slides for first language. First is this correlational evidence. So the basic idea of correlational or associational evidence is that this leverages the existence of individual differences. So the bottom line is that some people are better or worse at declarative memory, and those people, by prediction, should be better or worse at vocabulary. Others are better or worse at procedural memory, and those people should be differentially good or bad at grammar. That's the basic idea. Okay? It's taking advantage of the existence of individual differences to test the association between learning the memory systems and language abilities, either lexical or grammatical in this case. So there have been a number of studies to test this, both in first language, which is what this slide is, and second language, which we'll get to in a few slides. Both of these come from the same paper we published in 2018, both the first language and the second language results. These are results from a meta-analysis. Most of you know what a meta-analysis is, but I'll say so anyway. Basically, meta-analysis is a study of studies, taking together evidence from different studies, and the results from meta-analysis are generally more reliable and more generalizable than single study results because they're based on many studies. So this is a meta-analysis of these correlational studies in children, age 4 to 13, based on 10 studies, 39 correlations, and 424 children. And here's the bottom line. How good these children were at lexical abilities, like vocabulary size, for example, was a function of how good they were at learning in declarative memory. Okay, for example, where something was put in the room. Okay, but how good their lexical abilities were was not a function of how good they were at procedural memory, so learning sequences, for example. Tying lexical abilities to declarative, but not procedural memory. In contrast, grammatical abilities in these children correlated the medium effect size learning and procedural memory, like sequence learning, is non-linguistic, but also to some extent to learning and declarative memory. So you see this here, this is just the R values. Basically, lexical abilities in children are tied to declarative memory in blue, but not to procedural memory, whereas grammar is tied to procedural memory, but also to some extent to declarative memory. This is a very, very powerful approach, in my opinion. You can look at this paper. It's on our website. It's also published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Now we turn to neurological evidence. So here we're contrasting medial temporal lobe amnesia with developmental language disorder. This tends to be an adult onset disorder. This tends to be developmental, but both seem to involve learning problems, but differentially between the two systems. So medial temporal lobe amnesia obviously affects the medial temporal lobe, right? And here we see a picture of the brain of HM, the famous medial temporal lobe amnesic, right? Which resulted in this discovery of declarative memory and other memory systems. So we see his medial temporal lobe is missing, but not in controls. This, of course, results in declarative memory problems. That's how it was discovered in HM, and in word learning problems. But the basal ganglia in medial temporal lobe amnesics is typically normal, as is procedural memory. That's how it was discovered, right, in HM, and grammar learning, okay? So you have problems here with declarative memory and lexical abilities, but relatively spared basal ganglia and grammar. Developmental language disorder seems to be more or less the opposite, or a double dissociation of associations, if you will. So the medial temporal lobe, as we'll see later in a paper of ours that's currently under review, seems to be relatively normal. Declarative memory and word learning are relatively normal, okay? We'll talk about that later. We'll get to DLD. In contrast, the basal ganglia are clearly abnormal, particularly the caudate nucleus, which we see here, particularly the head of the caudate nucleus, quite specific. We'll see this later. Procedural memory is abnormal, quite clearly by now, including in meta-analyses that we'll look at later. And grammar learning is one of the key problems in DLD. So we have this beautiful dissociation of associations with linking through neurological evidence, declarative memory with lexical abilities and procedural memory with grammatical abilities. And we see this very similar associations between Alzheimer's disease, which shows a pattern similar to this, and Parkinson's disease, which shows a pattern similar to DLD. There's also evidence for declarative memory compensation in both DLD, which we'll see later, and Parkinson's disease. So I'll mention that now, since we're not going to talk about that later. In particular in women, not surprisingly, because their declarative memory is better. The paper last year showing this in Parkinson's disease patients in collaboration with people in Iran, and now we have one under revision now, showing the same thing in the US in English. How about neuroimaging evidence? So it's obviously very difficult to use neuroimaging like fMRI in infants or young children learning a language. In fact, this is a real gap in literature. There's very little work in this, mainly because it's difficult. And so most work uses a proxy, which is looking at adults learning either words, like pseudo words, made up words, or grammar learning in paradigms like artificial grammar learning, artificial language learning, or reduced natural languages, sometimes called mini languages. So we did a neuroanatomical meta-analysis of this using this technique, activation likelihood estimation, which brings together all these studies and sees where the common activation is. And we found the following. So these are, again, in adults, as kind of a proxy for L1 kids, but it's just a proxy. Word learning here, grammar learning here, like artificial grammar, artificial language, okay? And so, sorry, that's wrong. Word and grammar learning in both. So word learning is in blue, grammar learning in orange, and the overlap in pink. So both word and grammar learning yield activation in inferior frontal cortex and in posterior parietal cortex. But only word learning leads to activation in this ventral temporal lobe region that's closely associated with declarative memory, and only grammar learning in the basal ganglia, specifically in anterior, mid-anterior portions of the caudate nucleus, as well as anterior portions of the putamen, exactly those portions that are involved in learning and procedural memory. Okay. And then we split grammar into declarative and non-declarative grammar learning groups. That is, studies that had used ways of learning grammar that are predicted to depend particularly on declarative memory, such as encouraging chunk learning, analogical rules, and explicit instruction. And so these grammar learning studies yielded hippocampal activation, and the non-declarative grammar learning studies, which didn't use those techniques to encourage learning in declarative memory, did not. And conversely, only non-declarative grammar learning resulted in basal ganglia activation, again in the anterior caudate in the putamen. So the bottom line of this, and this is a lot of new stuff for you, is that, for many of you, is that this ties word learning to temporal lobe regions that are not the medial temporal lobe itself, but are closely tied to the medial temporal lobe, and grammar learning to the basal ganglia, that directly those structures underlying procedural memory. But grammar itself can be pushed back and forth, right? If you have grammar learning in conditions that encourage learning in declarative memory, such as learning explicit rules or chunking, then it depends on the hippocampus, on declarative memory, but otherwise it depends on procedural memory. Very, very nice. And then finally, the last slide for first languages, electrophysiological evidence from event-related potentials, which, as you know, many of you are scalp-recorded potentials that record potentials, electrical responses from the brain in response to a particular stimulus, like following, for example, a word or an object. So perhaps the best known of the language-related ERPs, ERP components, as they're usually called, is the N400, N for negative potential, 400 because it occurs about 400 milliseconds after the presentation of the stimulus, the word or the object. This occurs, it's basically most negative on the top of the head. So this is the nose and the two ears. It's the top of the head, here and here. And the N400 is found consistently in response to lexical anomalies, like I like to eat shoes, okay? But not in response to grammatical anomalies, like yesterday I walk over there. It's also elicited by nonverbal semantic stimuli, like objects or faces, and it's been relatively clearly linked to medial temporal lobe structures, among others. And it's been posited by us in different papers that this reflects the processing and possibly the learning of information, declarative memory. So linking that, so the N400 is linked to declarative memory, it appears. The LAN, it's less clear, as with everything else about procedural memory. The LAN stands for the left anterior negativity, so it's anterior and or left. The LAN is not elicited by lexical anomalies, like I like to eat shoes. It's reasonably often, not totally reliably, elicited by grammatical anomalies, such as yesterday I walk over there. It's also been shown to be elicited by nonverbal sequences. It's automatic, it's early, it's been linked to frontal regions, and we've cautiously suggested it might reflect aspects of processing or learning and procedural memory. So over the last 4 slides, using different techniques, we've seen that converging evidence seems to suggest the following: that in first language, learning words depends on declarative memory, learning grammar depends on procedural memory, but can also depend on declarative memory, particularly under certain circumstances that push learning in that direction. So now let's turn to second language. So this is a reminder of what we said earlier, this first slide, next slide. So declarative memory improves during childhood, right? And plateaus in adolescence and early adulthood. The developmental trajectory of procedural memory is less clear, as most things with procedural memory, but it seems to be established pretty early and may attenuate during childhood or adolescence. Therefore, we predict that earlier language learners, that is L1, both in L1 or early L2 learners, should rely more on procedural memory, right? Because it's more available. And later learners more on declarative memory for those things, those tasks and functions, including grammar or navigation or what have you, that can rely on either system. However, procedural memory should be only somewhat attenuated in adults, right? A 20-year-old can still learn to ride a bicycle, as I mentioned before. Therefore, with enough exposure, perhaps of the right type, maybe immersion, as we discussed briefly, at least some proceduralization of the grammar should occur, that is, learning and then subsequent dependence on what's learned in procedural memory. Contra to strong versions of the critical period hypothesis, which states that past a certain age, you cannot no longer depend on, in this case, the neurocognitive substrates of grammar in first language. So this is the same thing, the predictions, but schematically shown. So basically, lexical memory should always depend on declarative memory in first and second language, disorders, etc. So this is a very strong prediction. In contrast, grammar should depend differentially on declarative and procedural memory as a function of these factors, more in L2 than L1 in declarative memory, and more on declarative memory for lower than higher exposure experience because you haven't proceduralized yet, right? And conversely, this is just the flip of this, grammar should depend more on L1, more on procedural memory in L1 than L2, and more on higher than lower exposure experience L2 because you proceduralized more. So let's see what the evidence suggests. So this is the same paper that I mentioned before, but now we're looking at second language. So this is a meta-analysis of correlational studies in adult learned L2. 6 studies, 17 correlations, 236 learners. So it's, again, a pretty large sample size. And here, rather than looking at lexical and grammatical ability, studies have, fortunately for us, because it's much more interesting, looked at L2 grammar abilities at low experience, low L2 experience, and high L2 experience. Much more interesting, right? And the bottom line is very simple. It's really strong effect, is that L2, that grammar abilities at low L2 experience are predicted by how well people learn in declarative memory, but not how well people learn in procedural memory, and vice versa at high L2 experience. That is that at low L2 experience, grammar correlates with declarative memory, blue, but not with procedural memory. At high L2 experience, grammar correlates with procedural memory, but not with declarative memory. This really nicely ties grammar in L2 to declarative memory at low experience and procedural memory at high experience. About neurological evidence. So lesions to the temporal lobe, such as in Alzheimer's disease, have been shown to lead to more problems with L2 than L1, both lexically and grammatically. So that's not surprising. The L2 is weaker, right? So the words are learned later. They haven't heard them as much in L2 than L1. And here, this is our actual prediction, right? That grammar depends more on L2 declarative memory than in L1. But this isn't that surprising because the L2 is weaker. This is the striking part right here, okay? So there's evidence now from a number of studies from both Parkinson's disease and stroke that frontal or basal ganglia lesions lead to more problems with the grammar in L1 than L2, and more problems with the grammar at higher L2 exposure experience than lower. This is really striking, right? Because these are, the grammar was learned better in the cases where it's more damaged. So this is a very, very powerful result. In contrast, it appears that even in the same patients, you don't find the same difference in lexical abilities. That it's not the case that lexical abilities are worse in L1 than L2 or in L2 higher than lower exposure. So this neurological evidence, focusing on this square here, really nicely links grammar to procedural memory, particularly in L1 and high exposure L2 as predicted. So this is a different neuroanatomical meta-analysis. That's actually why I got confused before, because stupidly we're using the same colors. So this is still in preparation, so this may change, so take this with a grain of salt. In fact, we're doing a new search now for newer studies, so this will change to some extent at least. So this, whereas the previous meta-analysis looked at language learning paradigms, there's artificial grammar learning for grammar, for example, or word learning pseudo words, this is actually just L2. This is natural language learning of L2 or compared to L1, usually in the same subjects in these studies, but this is a meta-analysis, remember. So here, this is lexical abilities in L2 and L1. This is grammatical abilities in L2 and L1. So let's look at these separately. So lexical abilities in both L1 and L2, you find, again, inferior frontal and posterior parietal activation, but only in L2 do you find the same exact region with totally independent studies as in the other meta-analysis, showing there's really something there, this inferior ventral temporal lobe region that is pretty closely linked to declarative memory. In contrast, in grammatical tasks, only in L2 do you find this basal ganglia, anterior caudate putamen basal ganglia activation, which makes sense because if you remember from the procedural memory slide earlier on, that these structures are involved in learning and only later are they involved in, whereas what's learned in these structures later depends on neocortex, not on these structures. So this makes sense because the L2 individual is still learning the grammar, just like in the other meta-analysis, actually, right? But in L1, they're no longer learning it, so they're depending on neocortex. Something similar actually may be going on here, where the L1, the reason we don't find this activation L1 is maybe it's been more what's called systems consolidation that's gone on. And so the distributions for words are more distributed, but we're not sure. And then finally for L2, let's look at electrophysiology. So we would predict, of course, that N for hundreds should be found for L1 and for L2, and for L2 at low and high exposure, because you always have to learn words in declarative memory, and that's what's found. It's really quite robust in the literature. You always get it for hundreds for I like to eat shoes, okay, whether you're a first or second language speaker or second language speaker at low or high exposure. But syntactic and other grammatical and all this show different patterns. So they, as we saw before, in L1, they lead to left anterior negativities, which have been maybe tied to procedural memory. But in low exposure L2, you don't find that. You don't get lands. You sometimes get this attention-related ERP component. It can be interpreted as what's called a P3A, attention-related, and sometimes an N400 as well. Okay, so linking this to declarative memory as well. But then at high exposure, you get lens. Okay, so over the last 4 slides, what we've seen is converging evidence that links in L2, I'm talking about L2 now, lexical abilities in L2 to declarative memory, and grammatical abilities in L2 to declarative memory at lower experience, L2 experience, and procedural memory at higher L2 experience. This is this extra slide I told you I'd added. So there are implications of this theory for L2 learning and pedagogy. So one should be able to enhance L2 learning and retention via interventions, behavioral or pharmacological in principle. You may not want to do that, but principle, that enhance learning or retention in memory systems. And so this is one using the spacing and testing effect, which are known to enhance learning in primarily declarative memory. And so we looked at vocabulary learning, and so we could enhance vocabulary learning in Turkish, English as a second language students with collaborators in Turkey. And so spacing effect, you may know about this. So basically, if I tell you that the capital of Brazil used to be Salvador, and I say, Salvador, 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 you will remember it less well a year from now than if I space out the presentation of Salvador by a week or by a month. Okay? The testing effect is that if I ask you what the capital of Brazil was originally, right, and you come up with Salvador, you're much more likely to remember it in the longer term than if I tell you what it is. Okay, so we combined these spacing and testing effects. So here's the pre-test of these Turkish students learning English vocabulary, and then after training, and then after retention, delayed post-test. And it's really a striking difference between the two. So basically, this really works as just a demonstration. And of course, testing and spacing effects are already known to work, but this is specifically targeting L2 and combining them, which has not been done before. This shows that basically techniques that involve that sort of memory enhancement techniques, if you will, also apply to language. Finally, the last part of the talk is neurodevelopmental disorders. And I'll talk about a neurocognitive hypothesis, which derives from the declarative procedural model. So the hypothesis is that various developmental disorders result, at least in part, from abnormalities of brain structures underlying procedural memory. So this is a brain-based hypothesis. In particular, it's a neuroanatomical hypothesis. In contrast, declarative memory is posited to remain largely normal and can compensate for these deficits resulting from procedural memory problems, as well as other problems in the disorders, because declarative memory is such a flexible learning system. It can do about almost anything, so it can compensate for all kinds of things. These disorders may include at least developmental language disorder, that is specific language impairment, dyslexia, developmental reading disorder, autism, Tourette syndrome, ADHD, and others as well, probably including in certain ways, obsessive compulsive disorder, as well as developmental coordination disorder. And this paper here, it's here, I hope it's here, Ullman and Pullman 2015, talks about a lot of this compensation. So if you're interested in This hypothesis that we're talking about here may explain a wide range of behavioral and brain patterns in the disorders and their comorbidities with each other, because the same structures are being affected, albeit in different ways, probably with different additional structures, but nonetheless, that may explain the comorbidities. I should also mention, I had forgotten about this, that this paper here, Ullman, Walensky, and Janaszek, 2020, was published a few months ago in Annual Review of Psychology. That's one of the ones that I suggested. That's on the YouTube website where this is being streamed. So I have two papers on that. One is Ullman 2020, which is on the model in second language. It was cited earlier. And then this focuses on developmental language disorders, including developmental disorders of language, including developmental language disorder, but also dyslexia and others. Okay, you want to check that out. So what is developmental language disorder, or DLD? So it's a developmental disorder of language in the absence of other problems, of not being able to hear, of environmental deprivation, being locked in a closet, of emotional problems, of gross neurological damage, having your head chopped off or something. It's basically language problems in the absence of other causes. Grammatical aspects of language, in particular syntax, morphology, and phonology, are particularly affected. And just to remind you, this generally was previously known as specific language, or SLI. Previous explanatory accounts have either focused on positing that DLD can be explained by a grammar-specific deficit. People like Heather van der Lilly and Myrna Gopnik, or Harold Clausen have proposed this. So this can explain the grammar problems, but it can't explain the working memory problems, the motor problems, other problems. Others have suggested that DLD is due to a processing deficit, for example, of working memory or processing rapidly incoming or very brief stimuli. So that can explain those problems, but not others, including, for example, the motor problems, not very easily, as well as some of the grammar problems. Plus, both of these, what might be called functional explanations. They're at the behavioral level, right? The cognitive level. But of course, DLD is rooted in the brain, right? It's not rooted in the big toe or the spleen. So a explanatory account that takes that into account, that incorporates both neurobiological as well as cognitive information, may have more explanatory power than just a cognitive, or for that matter, just a neurobiological account. It's in this spirit that we propose the procedural circuit deficit hypothesis, or PDH, initially in 2004, 2005, and then also more in depth in this Annual Review of Psychology article I just mentioned that's on the streaming YouTube website. So according to the PDH, DLD can be largely explained by abnormalities of brain structures. I put that in boldface, right? So this is a neuroanatomical hypothesis. Underlying procedural memory, in particular frontal basal ganglia circuits, especially Broca's region, the caudate nucleus, which underlie grammar and its procedural memory underpinnings. These abnormalities in turn, these brain abnormalities in turn, are posited to should lead to impairments of procedural memory, right? They're the substrates of procedural memory, and therefore grammar, which depends on procedural memory, but also they will likely result in problems with other functions that depend on these structures, including working memory, for example. Because these structures, the basal ganglia doesn't just do procedural memory, okay? It makes a lot of sense, but sometimes you have to get your head around this, right? And then these grammatical and other deficits will be at least partly compensated for by declarative memory, which is posited to be relatively spared in the disorder. So here's just an overview of the evidence. So that I'll be showing you. You've seen a version of this before when I compared medial temporal amnesia with DLD. So basically, the evidence suggests that the medial temporal lobe structures, declarative memory and lexical memory, remain relatively normal in DLD, but these are abnormal. That is, the basal ganglia, particularly the caudate, particularly the head of the caudate, is abnormal. Procedural memory is abnormal. Grammar is abnormal. And these other functions that depend on this circuit, these structures and associated circuitry, are also problematic, right? Even though they may not be directly related to procedural memory. That was that point that I said. It's difficult to get your head around sometimes in the last slide, such as motor skills, working memory, and rapid temporal processing. When we proposed this, the PDH, in 2004, 2005, there have been no studies of this, so this was very powerful. Right? This was actually a really clean prediction from the get-go. testing procedural memory, but since then, in quite a few studies, including a few meta-analyses, including this meta-analysis, which shows very clearly that procedural memory, learning and procedural memory is impaired in DLD. And here's a paper that's under review, so this may change. This is a quantitative synthesis of 27 papers that looked at the brain structures, abnormalities in DLD, using a new technique that we developed. It has 652 participants across the different studies. In studies of brain structure, 103 in functional imaging studies. So this is brain structure, this is functional imaging. So basically, in the structure of the brains of DLD, what's abnormal, it's in red, right? This is the consistency across studies weighted by subjects of abnormalities. You basically find abnormalities in frontal lobe and the basal ganglia, and you dive deep to more specific structures, and it's only in the basal ganglia and the head of the caudate. It's only in the caudate nucleus of the basal ganglia, and the head of the caudate is particularly affected. It's the head of the caudate. This is a cut this way, like this. So, and then in functional studies, you find a similar pattern. You always have to be careful of functional imaging because, of course, what activation you get depends on what the task will activate. So abnormalities are only going to be found where if task activates areas that are abnormal. So one has to be careful of it, unlike structural studies. But nonetheless, we get this meta-analysis shows abnormalities in frontal and basal ganglia activation structures, particularly in Broca's region, to some extent in the basal ganglia too. And the medial temporal lobe is not affected. Okay. So this is really nice, right? This basically really convincingly implicates the basal ganglia, particularly the caudate nucleus, particularly the head of the caudate, in DLD, and possibly in an explanatory way. We can't tell from this, but it's very reasonable that these abnormalities underlie, these structural abnormalities underlie DLD. In contrast, declarative memory remains relatively normal, consistent with the medial temporal lobe absence of abnormalities we saw on the last slide. Learning new information remains relatively normal for non-verbal material, and even relatively normal for verbal material once you control for language or working memory impairments, which can be done in different ways. Some of these papers do that. Long-term knowledge and declarative memory also is relatively spared, particularly once one again controls for working memory from neurological or recall deficits. And there's compensation. There's increasing, it's still not that much evidence, but there's increasing evidence that declarative memory compensates for these grammatical deficits in DLD. So individuals with DLD memorize complex forms as chunks, like walked or the cat, rather than implicitly combining their parts, presumably in procedural memory. This evidence is mainly from frequency effects. Individuals with DLD can learn explicit roles, again, depending on declarative memory. And there's some nice correlational evidence. Grammatical abilities have been shown to correlate with procedural memory in typically developing children, but with declarative memory in children with DLD, suggesting compensation. So this is a paper of ours from 2012 with Jared Ullman, Gina Conti-Ramsden. And basically we found here that vocabulary abilities correlated with declarative memory in typically developing children, but with grammar and procedural memory children, as we'd expect according to the model. But look in DLD, children with DLD, both of these correlate with only declarative memory, suggesting that there's a shift of grammar from procedural, a compensatory shift from procedural to declarative memory in DLD. And there's also evidence from event-related potentials for the same shift this is work by Heather Vanderlily, who since passed away, unfortunately. Typically, developing children in the study show an N400 for lexical semantic anomalies, as we expect, and a LAN for syntactic anomalies. In DLD, kids show an N400 for both, suggesting a dependence. Interpret the N400 to depend on declarative memory. This suggests dependence on declarative memory for both, suggesting compensation of syntax and declarative memory by declarative memory. So, wrapping up. So here's a summary. This is this other slide that's like the earlier one, but with a bit more information. So you remember better what this is all about. There's a lot of information in this talk, I realize So we've seen that converging behavioral, neurological, neuroimaging, and electrophysiological evidence suggests that language, in fact, depends on both memory systems, and lexical and grammatical knowledge depend differentially on the two systems. In particular, the learning and processing of idiosyncratic, that is lexical knowledge, depends heavily on declarative memory and probably some, but very little on procedural memory. We talk a little bit about this in that Ullman et al. 2020 paper in neuropsychology. So if you want to know more about this. In contrast, rule-governed, that is grammatical knowledge, depends heavily on procedural memory, but also to a fair extent on declarative memory as a function of various factors, subject, item, input factors, such as, for example, the subject level, better declarative memory in females, or L2, meaning not kids, right, like young adults, or bad procedural memory, such as in DLD, or maybe older adults as well, to some extent, right, if procedural memory is attenuated. Or, for example, higher frequency forms like the cat walked, which can be chunked. So the two memory systems play at least partly redundant roles, coming back to that. Right? We started in the beginning when I first showed this slide, right? So I think this is important. There are a number of fields in the biological and social sciences, I think linguistics is among them to some extent, where things are explained by mutually exclusive accounts. So grammar is done this way. No, it's done this way. Let's fight about it. But that's not how biological systems work, right? Biological systems work very often by finding multiple solutions for a given problem. So the example I usually like to talk about is thermal regulation. So how do we keep our temperature at the right temperature? Shivering, fat, hair, antifreeze molecules in some organisms, drinking cold water, drinking hot soup, taking a shower, cold shower, hot shower, sweater, etc. Right? Get the point. There are many different solutions at different types, different levels for a given problem. So that's how biology addresses important problems. So it'd be very surprising if grammar, which is pretty important, right? I think you would all agree since you all study grammar, or language at least, would not be solvable by more than one approach. And so here we see that's the case, right? Not only can both systems do it, but this system can do it in multiple ways. Maybe this one too, but we don't know that yet. Okay, so this is pretty important, I think. There are various implications. I just stuck one up here. These are kind of fun. You may know that developmental disorders such as DLD or dyslexia, others as well, have higher prevalence in males. Okay, we suggest that maybe this may be caused in part, I'm not saying this too strongly, by underdiagnosis of females due to better compensation by females in declarative memory. Right? So you have two kids with DLD, right? Both have problems with declarative memory. Here's the male, here's the boy, here's the girl. Well, they'll compensate better. So on average, they may compensate their way out of diagnosis more successfully than males. After all, how is diagnosis made? Just by observing. We talked about this in this Ullman and Pullman paper in 2015, the former student of mine, Mariel Pullman. And then this is simply the same point that I made before for L2, that predictive therapeutic improvements with interventions, behavioral, pharmacological, that enhance learning retention in the memory system should also work for disorders like DLD or other disorders, right? You could enhance either system. You could enhance procedural memory, or you could enhance the compensatory system, declarative memory. It gets really interesting. And then some new directions, briefly, we're applying the same principles of co-optation and the memory systems to other domains. So looking at both reading and math. So we've suggested that dyslexia can be explained in part by the PDH in this recent paper that I've mentioned. A new paper with one of our co-authors, Sayako Earl, who's at the University of Delaware, assistant professor. We have a study with her and Lori Cutting at Vanderbilt, which indicates that typical developing children actually learn to read in part based on declarative and procedural memory. Similar for math. So with Tanya Evans, we've suggested that math disability, developmental math disability, can be explained in part by procedural memory problems and compensation by declarative memory to some extent. And we have some evidence from typical children that supports this as well, including with Lori Cutting. And then we're also working with other people on this, other projects. And then finally, aging. we've suggested that lexical declines in aging, right? This is like this word finding problem that a lot of us have when we get older, right? May be explained at least in part, or maybe largely actually, by underlying declines in declarative memory, especially the hippocampus, right? Because if words are learned in the hippocampus, okay, then the hippocampus declines, which it really does in aging, okay, it's really strong, then that should result in word finding problems. We call this the DAD hypothesis, the declarative aging deficit hypothesis. So we can say in our papers and grants, according to DAD, or DAD predicts, because that's sort of fun. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I could sit here and, hear you talk for more 10 hours,
It's a bit long, sorry about that.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful. It was really, really nice. Thank you. We have a few questions, if you don't mind, nope. From people who are watching us. So there are a couple of questions on sex differences, and I know you like to talk about it. So I'm going to make the two questions together, okay? Even though they talk about different topics. So the first one, granted the bias toward declarative memory, will women have a harder time to recuperate from Broca's aphasia than men? And the second, if estrogen enhances declarative memory, maybe we should separate men and women in lexically based learning tasks like training paradigms, for instance, for data analysis, maybe. What's your...
Yeah, so the first one is I'm not aware of that. I think this is actually in a little bit in the Ullman and Pullman 2015 paper on compensation that focuses on developmental disorders, but at the end we talked a little bit about other disorders, including Parkinson's and aphasia. I thought if anything it was the other way around, but the evidence was mixed that women might have a better time recovering than men. So I would love for whoever asked that question is welcome to email me and we can discuss that. And I'd love to learn about anything that contradicts this theory.
Okay.
In terms of that's right. So, yeah, I'm always, as a basic researcher, I'm always hesitant to make recommendations about, policy or anything like that. One thing to keep in mind that I don't think I actually said, although I kind of implied it during the talk, is that, remember, the sex differences, it's not about sex, it's not about males versus females, it's about the likelihood that the systems in general differ in their abilities between the two sexes, right? So what you really want, it's kind of a proxy. It's kind of fun because, sex differences like other group differences can be interesting and people care about that. But it's in a way, it's a simple proxy for being better or worse at declarative and possibly procedural memory. It's a little bit more complex than that because, you test women at a certain age, then they could have differed earlier on, but not anymore. So you can't just look at differences at a certain age because then they could have differed differentially earlier on. It may not have made sense. But it's not really about male versus female. It's about that these tend to differ in the memory systems, and that's what we're interested in. So if, following your question, then, I guess everybody could be, I wouldn't suggest this, but everybody could be tested on their memory abilities, and then you could separate those people out, which may cross sex to some extent.
Okay. Can you close the slides, the file?
I can try.
So that, okay, now we can see you a bit better. Yes. So the other question is about attention. What is the role of attention in the development of each one of the memory systems?
It's a very good question. So basically what appears to be the case is that increased attention seems to increase learning in declarative memory and decrease correspondingly learning in procedural memory.
Decrease.
Increase in declarative.
Right.
Decrease in procedural. Yes. Okay. Yeah, which makes sense because even though declarative memory underlies both explicit and implicit knowledge appears to only be subserved by declarative memory. So attention is very closely related to awareness, right? These are all kind of different terms for the same thing, arguably, right? Then increasing attention increases explicit learning, which increases learning in declarative memory.
Okay, so now that you are at it, can you talk a bit about the implicit-explicit debate?
Sure. So historically, declarative memory, even the name declarative memory, was strongly and even uniquely associated with explicit knowledge that can be brought to awareness, right? And so even today, even researchers in cognitive neuroscience, less than before, but it's still true, they may talk about declarative memory as memory underlying explicit knowledge. Okay? This has been problematic for more than 20 years, though, because the same circuits that underlie explicit learning of explicit knowledge and declarative memory also underlie implicit knowledge. This is work by Marvin Chun and Liz Phelps in the late 1990s. So, if it quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, you call it a duck, right? If it's learning just a different color, right? One's explicit, one's implicit, but it's all like associations and stuff like that, right? So basically, so we define, and I did this in this talk, and it's even clear in the this recent Ullman et al. 2020 paper, we very clearly define declarative memory as learning and memory that depends on the hippocampus and associated circuits, okay? And procedural memory is the learning and memory that depend on the basal ganglion associated circuits. So that means that we're trying to do that to clarify that we're not defining it in terms of explicit or implicit knowledge. That's just a byproduct. And if it is, it isn't. That's why I even said in procedural memory that it seems like it's mostly implicit. It's not a definition. It's just a characteristic that may or may not be the case. And when you have, and then it gets even more complicated. This because we've worked on this together. If you have explicit input, so instructed input, you can learn explicitly or implicitly. Sorry, you can learn explicitly and implicitly, and you can learn in either system. So just because you have explicit input doesn't mean you only learn in declarative memory. And if you have implicit input that is uninstructed, you can also learn in both systems, like we've shown some of our work. So it's just something to be really careful of. So the bottom line, to avoid confusion given all this stuff, is that if you define the memory systems in terms of learning and memory in the underlying circuitry, declarative memory based on hippocampal and associated circuitry, and procedural memory in the basal ganglia, then you avoid a lot of these problems. And then basically the implicit explicit stuff sort of becomes secondary to a large extent.
What about sleep? The role of sleep in consolidation.
That's another good question. So sleep, this is actually, I have to learn more about consolidation from Sayoko Earl, who I mentioned before. She's really into consolidation in the memory systems. And so basically, the evidence seems to suggest that improvements from sleep only occur in stuff learned in declarative memory and not in procedural memory. So that's a way of distinguishing the two, which is kind of cool, actually. It's another way of distinguishing the two.
This is really cool. Yeah, of course, you need many instances in order to acquire knowledge in procedural memory.
But if you actually see an improvement overnight, that's probably declarative memory.
Declarative memory.
A characteristic of declarative, of hippocampal-based, but not procedural-based learning.
That's really cool. Yeah. Okay, so on reading, right? Can you talk about the interplay between the memory systems as children are building their graphophonemic repertoire and breaking visual invariance as they are learning to decode, like the first steps of reading?
Yeah, so I want to answer that in a broader way, which is basically something I've thought a fair bit about. I was just talking to another collaborator recently about this. I think what the question's really getting at, even beyond reading, is when should you, kind of almost from an applied perspective, when is it beneficial to push learning in one or the other system, in what order, right? And the bottom lines, I don't know. So declarative memory is faster, right? So you should probably do initial learning in declarative memory. And if you don't do that, procedural memory will be slowed down. But then if you do that, you might inhibit procedural memory as well. So, if you put if you force me to answer, I would say, like you said, you have to say something. I would say probably initially try to encourage learning through these various means, right? Slow feedback, implicit learning, so on and so forth, in declarative memory, and then gradually in some way shift, pushing towards procedural memory. This is all for stuff like grammar that can be in either system, right? Declarative memory.
Right.
That's not unreasonable, but because of the competition, it gets trickier.
And it depends on the context too, right?
Probably. Yeah. And what your goal is, right? Because if your goal is, for example, to learn things quickly, then go for declarative. If your goal is to become automatic and have long-term retention, you want to eventually at least push proceduralization or automatization. Yeah.
All right. What about working memory? What is the relation between working memory and both memory systems?
So it depends on how you define working memory, but the way I think working memory is generally conceived of is essentially attention, right? I mean, like, Nelson Cowan's view rather than Badley's view.
Focused attention.
Yeah, it's basically attention. It's attention towards long-term memory representation, Nelson Cowan's view, right? I think that's probably a more accurate theory at this point than Badley's view based on what we know. And so that kind of answers the question, right? Guess based on the previous question, right? So working memory plays a very strong role in declarative memory. Very, very strong role. Does it play a role in procedural memory? Probably, maybe, when you think of like sentences and processing of sentences, is that working memory? Is that conscious working memory? So I'm less certain on that side. I think it's clear to me on the declarative memory side.
Right. Okay. So I don't know if you want to say, it's okay. So
that's what I could think of.
All right.
I apologize, everybody, for speaking quickly. I told myself I wouldn't, and I probably did. So my apologies to everybody for speaking quickly.
One of the nicest things about these talks is that, people can watch it as many times as they want.
Not that they should, but yes.
Yeah, but they probably should. Yeah, maybe. But I mean, it doesn't matter if you may have talked too fast. I mean, people can watch it again over and over, right? And we've been recommending these talks to our students and even classes. So it's really nice. So I thank you and Michael and everyone for joining us in today's talk. Thank you for being here for such a wonderful talk, for the lively discussion, for being available to answer these questions. And it's been a real pleasure for me to have you here today. So I invite you to say just a few final words, say goodbye. Everyone.
Yeah, the main thing is, thank you very much, Miguel and Ingrid, for hosting me. And thank you, everybody, for listening. I appreciate that. Also, I guess I should add that if anybody has questions, they can email me. So that's it.